I want to welcome Professor Schneer. And after the book talk, he will conduct a Q&A.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Bremen Center, for arranging this whole thing. I'm delighted to be here. So, let me just organize what's on the desk here. Okay. The Balfour Declaration, the subject of my book. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the history or the details. Let me explain a little bit of it. The Balfour Declaration was accepted by the British government on the 2nd of November, 1917, which is to say during the depths of World War I, when it was by no means clear that Britain would win it, or maybe Germany would win it. It was not clear. By the declaration, Britain promised to support the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Now today, the Balfour Declaration is seen by some as the foundation stone of modern Israel and therefore as a document to be celebrated. Of course, others see it as the first step toward Arab dispossession and misery and therefore something to be deplored. Every historian who has examined the subject, and there have been many, has viewed it, the Declaration, as the inevitable byproduct of growing Anglo-Zionist intimacy during World War I in Great Britain. And all the other books about this subject have celebrated the remarkable campaign led by the Zionist leader in Britain, who was Chaim Weizmann, the Russian-born chemist now living in Great Britain. As I say, other books about this subject have celebrated the campaign that he did conduct in Britain to teach the principles of his movement, Zionism, to the British political elite. Now, I don't in any way discount Weizmann's remarkable campaign or his extraordinary qualities. He was one in a million, one in 10 million, perhaps. Nevertheless, my book emphasizes not the inevitability of Weizmann's triumph, but rather its contingency. The Balfour Declaration, as I came to realize, nearly didn't happen. Moreover, it wasn't written in stone. I found out that even after its publication, the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, was prepared to finesse it under certain circumstances, as I'll be explaining. So let's begin. Let's see if this works. Yes, good. 1914. Palestine in those days was a part of the Ottoman Empire, whose capital, of course, was in Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire included much of the Middle East, most of the Middle East, including what was then called Mesopotamia. Today we would call it Iraq, and Syria, which then was defined as including Lebanon and Palestine, the Arabian Peninsula, even Egypt. However, bringing us to Egypt tells us something important. Although Egypt was de jure under Ottoman control, it was de facto under British control. And that is because Britain had great interest in Egypt, because that's where the Suez Canal is located, and the vast bulk of trade that went through the Suez Canal was British, especially to Britain's empire further east in South Asia. I should also point out that the French had long-standing imperial interests in the Middle East, in Syria that dated back all the way to the Crusades, and in Lebanon, and then along the North African coast. Now, in 1914, the Ottoman Empire was ruled by a revolutionary political party called the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP. And the CUP was dominated by three men, two of whom will figure in our story this afternoon, so I'll mention their names now. One was called Enver, the other was called Talat. These men had made the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire into their puppet. The thing is, the Sultan was also the Caliph of Islam, the most holy figure, the leading figure in the Islamic religion. Now, in 1914, the Ottoman dependent ruler of the Hijaz, which is the westernmost part of what today we would call Saudi Arabia, was this man, Grand Sharif Hussein. He was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, and because he was the emir of the Hijaz and the Grand Sharif Hussein of Mecca and Medina, he was in charge of the two holiest cities in the Islamic religion, Mecca and Medina, and he was therefore perhaps the second most important figure in the Islamic religion, or anyway, an extremely holy figure. And that is important, as you'll be hearing. Now, the Grand Sharif Hussein nurtured ambitions. He wanted some greater autonomy within the Ottoman Empire, maybe even independence. Certainly he became a nationalist in the sense that we would understand as World War I progressed. And by the way, in the years before 1914, he was not the only important Arab figure to have such ideas. Various groups in the Arab world were forming, and in fact, a kind of the first Arab Nationalist Congress took place in Paris in the year 1913. Now, in that same year, Abdullah sent his son, his second son, he had four, but he sent this son, Abdullah, to speak with the British in Cairo. Why? Because he was worried about the Turks. He was worried about the Ottomans. He thought they might try to depose him. He thought maybe he would rebel against them. And so he had Abdullah talk to Field Marshal Horatio Kitchener, who was the consul general, the British consul general in Cairo, and Kitchener's most important aide, Sir Ronald Storrs. What did Grand Sharif Hussein ask for? He asked for machine guns and British support should his father come to blows with the Ottomans. But the two men turned him down flat. They said, we have friendly relations with the Ottoman Empire, and we can't do this. Then, however, came the outbreak of World War I. Britain feared quite correctly that the Ottomans would side with Germany. And if they did so, there was a real nightmare scenario for them, because the Ottoman Caliph would call for a jihad, and then Muslims all around the world would at least consider rising up against the enemies of the Ottomans, and there were 100 million Muslim subjects scattered throughout the British Empire, most significantly in South Asia, but also in Egypt and in the Sudan. This was a real nightmare for them. Kitchener was in London when the war began. Storrs was in Cairo. Storrs immediately cabled Kitchener and said, maybe we should talk to Abdullah and send machine guns to his father, the Grand Sharif, after all. And they were thinking that if the Grand Sharif would take up arms against the Ottomans, that would certainly dilute any call for a jihad that the Caliph might declare. And so Kitchener told Storrs to go ahead and inquire of Abdullah, who would of course talk to his father, if we were willing to support you with weapons and advice and money, would you rebel against the Ottomans? They even, in this very first letter, dangled the possibility of overthrowing the Sultan and therefore the Caliph, and of allowing the Grand Sharif Hussein to become the Caliph in his stead. Now, of course, the British, that's a gift that the British can't make, but they made it, or they made the offer. So began a fateful correspondence carried out during 1915 and 1916. Now, Kitchener's temporary replacement in Cairo was this man, Sir Henry McMahon, and I chose this particular depiction of him because I think just possibly it suggests a man who was not overly scrupulous with words. The McMahon-Hussein correspondence of 1915-1916 is one of the most infamous in history. McMahon promised in his letters to Hussein that Britain would support, assuming that Hussein rebelled against the Ottomans, and that Britain and Hussein prevailed in the struggle, that Britain then would support creation of an independent Arab kingdom of which Hussein would be the leader. But the question was, what would be its boundaries? Here, everything depends upon the translation of certain English words into Arabic, and then how Hussein interpreted them. Historians have parsed these letters with a fine-tooth comb, but of course they disagree. I can't settle the disagreements, but I'll tell you the crux of it. Zionists and supporters of McMahon conclude that in the letters, McMahon excluded Palestine from the projected Arab kingdom. On the other hand, Arabs and critics of McMahon have concluded the opposite, that Palestine was meant to be included in this projected Arab kingdom. As I say, I can't possibly settle this dispute, but what I can do, what is indisputable, is this. What I can conclude is this. McMahon's language was intentionally vague. I can quote to you a letter that he wrote to a superior figure at the Foreign Office whose name was Lord Harding. Here is what he wrote in this letter. What we have to arrive at now is to tempt the Arab people into the right path, detach them from the enemy, and bring them onto our side. This, on our part, is at present largely a matter of words, and to succeed, we must use persuasive terms and abstain from academic haggling over conditions. And McMahon was successful. Hussein, with his encouragement, launched a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire in June 1916. Now, meanwhile, back in London, the British realized that they needed to bring their French allies in the war into the picture. And so they deputed this man, Sir Mark Sykes, to speak for them to the French. Sykes was an advisor to the government on Middle Eastern affairs and quite a remarkable character. The French chose to speak for them François-Georges Picot, likewise a remarkable figure. The two men got along perfectly well, and they met in a room in the Foreign Office, and they pulled out the maps, and they pulled out crayons, and they quite literally redrew the map of the Middle East. Very, very broadly. France was to control the blue area, Syria, and up above. Britain was to control the red area, today Iraq, or much of it, and then called Mesopotamia. Area A would be under French influence. The ruler there of the projected Arabian kingdom would have French advisors, and I'm quoting loosely here, whose advice they must accept. And the same in Area B, there would be British advisors, and the same arrangement. What we have here, this is the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement. What we have here, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, is an unvarnished, old-fashioned example of European imperialism. So to summarize what we've gotten to so far, At British prompting and with British help, the Grand Sharif Hussein proceeded with a rebellion against Turkey. He may or may not have thought that Palestine would be part of his projected kingdom. He certainly did not know that the European allies had the boundaries of his future kingdom planned for him, plus their own roles within it. Now, British deceit, I can't speak about the French, but I'm the British historian. British deceit drove certain British officers who knew about it crazy. And here is the most famous person to be driven crazy by it, Lawrence of Arabia, and I choose this particular depiction because maybe it suggests to me a man who is troubled. Lawrence wrote to his superior, and I'm quoting from a letter. He's speaking about the Arabs. "We are getting them to fight for us on a lie, and I can't stand it." Now, back in London, of course, there was another group that took profound interest in Palestine. I'm referring to Zionists. Zionists say that Palestine, the homeland of Jews in ancient times, should be the homeland of the Jews now. I'm speaking in 1914 or 1900. It was part of the Ottoman Empire before World War I. The problem was the Ottomans absolutely would not give it back. In 1897, an Austrian journalist named Theodor Herzl founded the World Zionist Federation. The aim of this federation was to persuade, they had given up, they tried to persuade the Turks to allow, say, unrestricted Jewish immigration into Palestine. That didn't work. So instead, their aim was to persuade one of the great powers to exert pressure on Turkey on their behalf. But it was unsuccessful. The strategy wasn't working. By 1914, Zionism had spread. There was a world organization with headquarters in Berlin, but they were no nearer their goal than they had been in 1897. In Great Britain, Zionism was relatively weak. There was a British population in 1914 of 41, 42 million. The Jewish population of Great Britain was 300,000, of whom 8,000 belonged to several competing Zionist organizations. The fact is that before 1914, most British Jews thought that Zionism was a beautiful but an impractical dream. And they didn't have a lot of time for the visionaries who were advocating it, not because they were unfriendly. I don't think that. That there was much latent support for Zionism would become apparent later. But so long as it remained outside the realm of practical politics, they were too busy earning a living to join Zionist organizations. And then there were some British Jews who objected very strongly to Zionism. And they were, by and large, the spokesmen of the British Jewish community. They belonged to an exclusive group called the Cousinhood of intermarried and extremely wealthy figures. And these people argued that Jews share a culture and a belief system, but that they do not represent a distinct nation, a separate people. They can practice their beliefs anywhere, and in fact they should, but they should also assimilate in the countries where they were born. And so they're called assimilationists. The assimilationists went even further. They argued that Zionists who insisted that the homeland of the Jewish people was Palestine were opening up the Jews of Britain and France and the United States and Canada to a charge of dual loyalty. They went even further than that. They said that the Zionists would be encouraging anti-Semitism because, according to the assimilationists, anti-Semites could now say something like, well, your true home is Palestine, so you should leave here. You should leave America. You should leave Great Britain. Go where you belong. One of them said, one of the assimilationists said, they will make Palestine into the world's ghetto. Now, by the way, I should have put this photograph up before. This man, Lucien Wolfe, was the leader of these anti-Zionist Jews in Great Britain. He is the leader of the assimilationists. Okay, now comes World War I. Of course, like every other people, Jewish people, Zionists in Britain were appalled. It was a world calamity. But then they realized that it might also present them with an opportunity. Should Britain win the war, that would mean the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. That would mean that the Turks could be expelled from Palestine. That would mean that the British could establish a protectorate there and then open it up to massive Jewish immigration. I think many people came to understand this fairly quickly. But the British-based Zionist who understood this best, who best seized the opportunity that it represented, was, of course, Chaim Weizmann. Weizmann had been born in Russia. He had left Russia to continue his education because, of course, education for Jews in Russia had insuperable obstacles. And so he received his PhD in chemistry in Switzerland. I think he also studied in Germany, actually, but then Switzerland. And he took, finally, a job at the University of Manchester in England. He was fairly well known in the world Zionist movement in the years before 1914. He was not one of the leaders of British Zionism in the years before World War I. There were 3 or 4 people more prominent than he. But with the war, he very quickly ascended and became, without any question, the leading British-based Zionist. Why? Well, first of all, it turned out that he was a diplomat of genius and could charm the British governing elite. He embarked upon what I call a charm offensive, and it was remarkably successful. He was a genius at teaching the British governing elite the principles of Zionism. He also managed to persuade them, quite against the facts, that all British Jews who counted were Zionists. But there's something more important about him. He was one of a very few who were able to practice a kind of political jujitsu and turn anti-Semitic prejudice to his own advantage and to the advantage of his movement. So, many in the British governing elite had grown up with, shall we say, stereotypical views about Jews. They represented a vast subterranean influence in the world. Yes, Weizmann said to them, we do, right? They thought Jews controlled finance, world finance, which would be very important in the war effort, and especially American finance. Yes, Weizmann said, you're right. They thought Jews were also behind the movement to pull Russia out of the war, but that that they were going to pull Russia out of the war. Weizmann said, yes, if you don't watch out, we'll do that. And so at his very subtle prompting, the British, many, not all, but many in the British governing elite put 2 and 2 together and, to put it baldly, came up with 5. To win the war, they must have Jewish support. To gain Jewish support, they must promise them something all Jews want. Well, Weizmann had taught them, all Jews are Zionists. What do all Zionists want? Palestine. So, the Balfour Declaration. This was Weizmann's extraordinary achievement based upon monumental bluff. Because, of course, we all know the Jews are not some powerful subterranean influence, least of all were they not in 1914. And moreover, it's very clear that not all Jews were Zionists. So let me sum up here at this point and see where we are. Through the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, the British had won Arab support. They had allowed the Arabs to think, quite mistakenly, that Britain would support the establishment of an independent Arab kingdom. Historians and partisans argue whether the Arabs believed from the outset that Palestine would be part of this projected kingdom, but it is indisputable that McMahon was intentionally vague about it, and about many other things, by the way. Simultaneously, the British had won Zionist support by promising to support the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. They did that quite unambiguously in the Balfour Declaration. So, Jews thought they would inherit Palestine. They had it in writing. Arabs thought that Palestine would probably form a part of their prospective kingdom, but they did not have it in writing. They had only McMahon's intentionally vague letters. Britain was creating future problems for itself and for everyone else in the Middle East. But so much is fairly well known. Now there's another dimension to the story which constitutes my original contribution and which, I'm sorry to tell you, further complicates the picture. So, from the moment that the Ottomans entered the war, there were British citizens who hoped to somehow arrange a separate peace with the Turks. Please understand here, Zionists believed that Turkish control over Palestine was their greatest obstacle. They wanted a total victory over Turkey, the institution of a British protectorate there, and then free immigration for Jews. So most British Zionists, I'm talking only about the British here, but most British Zionists were unalterably opposed to a separate peace with Turkey. Simultaneously, of course, the Arabs were engaged in a war of independence against the Turks and would have been extremely upset to learn that the British were negotiating with their enemies about a separate peace. So, who in Britain favored this separate peace with Turkey? First of all, a tiny, politically insignificant group, but one that interests me. They lacked, as I say, political influence and numbers, British Muslims. These people thought that it was a great tragedy that Great Britain, which governed an empire containing 100 million Muslim subjects in India, Egypt, and Sudan, should be at war with the Ottoman Empire, the greatest Muslim empire in the world. And so they just thought that there should be peace between these two Muslim empires. Secondly, and more politically significant, a group I would call British Turkophiles. These people believed that their country should return to its traditional policy, which was maintaining the Ottoman Empire in order to keep Russia from ever coming from the Black Sea and taking over Constantinople and then gaining free access to the Mediterranean. So they were very much opposed to the wartime alliance with Russia. They thought there should be an alliance with Turkey. Furthermore, there were more liberal Turkophiles who said the new government in Turkey, the revolutionary government, is a more progressive government and a more appropriate ally for liberal England than autocratic czarist Russia. Now, the Turkophiles, and there were plenty of British Muslims who worked with the Turkophiles, actually did have some influence. They organized a political pressure group called the Anglo-Ottoman Association. It attracted members of all three political parties from both houses, House of Commons, House of Lords. It recruited men of letters, businessmen, and the like. But more important than all of these was a much smaller group, but much more powerful, so-called Easterners within the government itself. These were men who had come to believe that Britain could never defeat Germany by smashing through the Western Front. It wasn't going to happen. The Western Front was a killing field, a charnel house, nothing more. And that therefore a back door to the Central Powers must be found, to Germany and Austria. And where was that back door located? And the answer is Turkey. And what do you do with a door? You can kick it open, which they tried in the ill-fated attempt at Gallipoli, another charnel house, another killing field. And when that didn't work, they thought, well, maybe the way to open the door is not with force, but by some secret arrangement. My book is Marmaduke Pickthall. Why is he up on the board, though? Why do I have a photograph of him, since, in fact, his effort was fruitless and, in fact, has elements of tragicomedy in it, really? And the answer is I just love his name, Marmaduke Pickthall. He was the son of an Anglican vicar. He converted to Islam. He wrote the first translation of the Quran into English. He was the author of many novels about life in the Ottoman Empire. His effort to travel to Switzerland to talk with dissident Turks whom he knew and who had contacted him, that effort was stymied by none other than his friend Mark Sykes, who would not allow him to have a passport to travel. And then I found another figure who got further, but actually more obscure than Pickthall, so obscure that I cannot find a photograph of him anywhere. His name was J.R. Pilling. He was a Turkophile. He belonged to that Anglo-Ottoman Association I told you about. He was a businessman with interests in Turkey. And actually, he wanted Britain and Turkey to arrive at a separate peace because it would profit him. He wanted to get his businesses going again in the Middle East. He actually got the passport and traveled to Switzerland and did meet with dissident Turks, but he was a rogue. He was irresponsible. The British government figured this out fairly quickly and disowned him, so he doesn't count either. But this man does count. Henry Morgenthau, an American who had made a fortune in New York real estate, and then who became both a donor and fundraiser for the Democratic Party, and who was rewarded by President Woodrow Wilson with a slot, with a position as the American ambassador to Turkey. Morgenthau came home. He finished his stint as ambassador in late 1916, and he and Wilson talked. Now, here it's important for you to know that when America entered the war, it did not declare war on Turkey, and Turkey did not declare war on the U.S. Therefore, Morgenthau said, I can go back and I can talk to my friends in the Revolutionary Committee of Union and Progress party, Enver and Talat and Jamal, a third, and I could find out what might be the basis for discussions about taking Turkey out of the war. And eventually, Wilson agreed. Morgenthau should go. He should travel to Palestine, ostensibly to check on the condition of Jews in Palestine during these war years, but really to talk to the Turks to find out what would be their terms for at least starting discussions about getting out of the war. The British government learned about this through their ambassador. They were informed by the State Department here. And at first they were in favor of Morgenthau's mission. But there was a problem. There was a problem. Morgenthau couldn't keep a secret. And it was essential from the British point of view that this mission be secret. because if word got out, then obviously it could offend the Jews, the Zionists, it could offend the Arabs. Even worse than that, maybe, people might begin to think, well, if Britain's interested in exploring peace talks with Turkey, maybe Britain's not so sure that it can win the war. And the British government didn't want people thinking that at all, so they decided they opposed Morgenthau's mission. Now, Morgenthau had such loose lips that the Anglo-Ottoman Association in London learnt about his mission and held a meeting at which they talked quite confidently about getting Turkey out of the war, and they mentioned Morgenthau's traveling to the east to talk to Turks. Weizmann learned about the meeting of the Anglo-Ottoman Association and what was said, and was furious, as you might have expected. By now he had entree into the Foreign Office, and so he stormed in to protest. He said, I want to stop Morgenthau. And the Foreign Office, which now opposed the mission, as I explained, for the reasons I explained, said, okay, we will send you to stop him. Morgenthau was going to break his journey at Gibraltar, and Weizmann traveled to Gibraltar. And there, in fact, he absolutely dominated Morgenthau in a meeting and humiliated him, and Morgenthau broke off his mission and, for face-saving reasons, basically traveled to Paris, where he met with the American General Pershing, and then right back to the United States. And he never went to Palestine, and he never talked to Turks. Weizmann had turned in a bravura performance. He went back to the Foreign Office. He received the congratulations there of officials there, who immediately sent him to Paris to speak with Balfour and Lloyd George, Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, who were at a meeting of a war meeting. And these two men, Lloyd George and Balfour, congratulated Weizmann too. However, simultaneously, the Foreign Office was arranging for this man, Aubrey Herbert, to travel to Switzerland to talk to Turks about a separate peace. Literally, just as the British government was sending Weizmann to Gibraltar to stop Morgenthau talking to Turks about a separate peace, they were sending Aubrey Herbert to Switzerland to talk to Turks about a separate peace. Weizmann never learned about this, and no historian of the Balfour Declaration has picked up on it either. Now, Aubrey Herbert has turned into my current favorite historical figure. These figures shift in my mind, but at the moment he occupies the top slot. He was the second son of the Earl of Carnarvon. He was the half-brother of the discoverer of the tomb of Tutankhamun. He was the model of John Buchan's Sandy Arbuthnot, who is the hero of the thriller Green Mantle. Some of you will have read John Buchan's 39 Steps. I think Green Mantle is the second best of his thrillers, and Herbert is the model for the hero of that thriller. Before the war, he had explored the Middle East, and he had explored the Near East, the old Ottoman Empire. He had ridden in Albania with bandits, but he was also very much respected by more respectable elements of Albanian society, so respected that in fact he was twice offered the throne of Albania. He turned it down, not because he wanted to accept it, but the British government would not let him. So this man traveled to Switzerland, ostensibly to recover from war wounds, but really to meet and talk to Turks. And he met them in various safe houses. He picked up messages left for him secretly on the platforms of railway stations. It's as good as a John Buchan novel. And then he wrote out a report, and he returned with the report and with the proposals from the Turks with whom he had met, who said that they planned to overthrow the CUP government and make a separate peace with Britain. Lloyd George and Balfour received him literally 2 days after receiving Chaim Weizmann in Paris. They received Weizmann on the 23rd of July, 1917. They received him on the 25th of July, 1917. Probably Weizmann was still in Paris. They had congratulated Weizmann on stopping the separate peace initiative of Morgenthau. Now they congratulated Herbert on starting a separate peace initiative. David Lloyd George, a confirmed Easterner, and just maybe this photograph suggests that he's a sly one. I'm not sure. He certainly was a sly one. But he could not get the idea of a separate peace out of his head. He never knew about Pichthal's aborted mission. He distrusted Pilling quite legitimately. He had come to oppose the blabbermouth Morgenthau, and he feared that Aubrey Herbert was talking only to, as he explains in a cabinet meeting, second-raters. Therefore, he chose another person to pursue the possibility of talks with Turkey, someone completely different from all the others, this man, Basil Zaharoff, the most infamous arms dealer of the period. Some of you may remember Basil Zaharoff from a British television series called Riley, Ace of Spies. He is the villain. He is also the stock villain arms merchant figure in the Tintin comic books. I should tell you, his first paying job as a child, he was a tout for a Constantinople brothel. He moved on from that to an arrangement with the Constantinople fire department, starting fires for a fee, and then sharing in the salvage. But he had gone on, he was a thief, he was a bigamist, he was a liar. He grew, in other words, a perfectly good partner for Lloyd George. He had grown fabulously wealthy as an arms dealer. Now, earlier in the war, Zaharoff had been contacted by Abdul Karim, who was the former Turkish minister to Greece and Austria. And Zaharoff remembers him quite fondly, as he writes at the time in a letter to a friend of his, I bribed him often in the pre-war days. Just one sec here. To cut short a long, complicated, but quite fascinating story, for full details of which please do read the book, Abdul Karim told Zaharoff that he represented Enver Pasha, one of the 3 leaders of the Ottoman Empire, and that Enver was interested in exploring a separate peace with Great Britain. Zaharoff managed to get this message to Lloyd George, who of course understood from the get-go that Enver Pasha was no second-rater. And so he empowered Zaharoff to meet Abdul Karim in Switzerland to find out what Turkey's terms for a separate peace might be. Now here, please notice, the Foreign Office and the War Office knew about Pilling's effort. The Foreign Office and the Cabinet knew about Aubrey Herbert's effort. And of course, they had known about Morgenthau's effort, but only Lloyd George and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the conservative leader, Andrew Bonar Law, knew about Zaharoff. And you may well ask, why did Andrew Bonar Law have to know? And the answer is that because he was Chancellor and therefore would be responsible for arranging the multi-million-dollar bribes which would be necessary to pull Turkey out of the war. $500,000 for Abdul Karim just for acting as a go-between, and then what amounted to $11.5 million more for the arch-conspirators who would be needing money to bribe people in Turkey, and then would need money when they all fled Turkey and moved to New York City to begin new lives. But please notice, Balfour, Arthur Balfour, Lloyd George's foreign secretary, the head of the Foreign Office, did not know about Zaharof's mission. So let me here try to unpeel the layers of intrigue we have going. Number one, Zionists would have been outraged, British Zionists would have been outraged to learn about all the missions I've been describing to you, since a separate peace would have allowed Turkey to maintain control of Palestine. Now, they knew only about Morgenthau, and Morgenthau they had defeated, but only because the British were also against Morgenthau. That's number one. Two, the Arabs, who were expecting the establishment of an independent kingdom of their own, would also have been outraged, since the Ottomans would have kept their territory if they had concluded a separate peace with Great Britain. But of course, the British government never told them. Then, of course, Aubrey Herbert would have been quite astonished to learn about Zaharof's mission, because he thought he was representing the British government in its separate peace discussions. But Lloyd George, to whom he reported, never told him. And then, as I say, quite astonishingly, Lloyd George never told Balfour about Zaharof's mission either, and this just as Balfour was about to put his name to the famous declaration promising British support for a national home for the Jews in Palestine. In other words, the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, was prepared to double-cross the Zionists, the Arabs, some of his emissaries, and his own foreign secretary in order to explore the possibility of a separate peace with Turkey. Now, I'm not a Turkish historian, but from the archives on the British side, I can discern an even darker picture of intrigue and betrayal on that side. Aside from Enver, the other great Turkish leader during this period was Talat. Now, at one point, Zaharof asked Abdul Karim why Talat was not part of the scheme, why he was only dealing with Enver. And Abdul Karim replied with regard to Talat that this man was proving a little difficult, but he would come round, and if he didn't, and I quote, "I myself will give him his coffee." This meant, of course, that he would poison him. But what he didn't know, and what I only eventually discovered, was that Talat had been behind the overtures to Pickthall, Pilling, and Herbert. Now, Zaharof met Abdul Karim several times in Switzerland during the summer and fall of 1917, but the climax came on the 27th of January 1918. Enver snuck into Switzerland. Zaharof was already there to meet him. They did not come face to face. Instead, Abdul Karim shuttled between them. Zaharof writes that Abdul Karim acted as a human telephone in his letter reporting to Lloyd George. Now, Lloyd George had provided Zaharof with Britain's desiderata, they're called, the negotiating position that Britain would have. The crux from our point of view for this talk today is the following, and I'm quoting from the instructions Lloyd George had delivered to Zaharof. Quote, "Palestine will not be annexed or incorporated in the British Empire." Please note, this is nearly 3 months after publication of the Balfour Declaration. Had Enver accepted the various negotiating positions that Lloyd George had provided, nobody would think very much today about the Balfour Declaration at all. It would have been sidelined by history. It would be merely another of the many beautiful promises made during the war by politicians of all countries and of all parties to persuade men to go on fighting and dying. It would count as much as those other beautiful promises did. You'll remember some of them: no annexations and no indemnities, or open covenants openly arrived at, or, I think most sad of all, war to end all wars. But Enver did not accept. Why? Think of the timing. January 1918, Russia has just been defeated, is just about to surrender. at Brest-Litovsk, and I think that Enver probably thought that Germany and Turkey could win the war after all. In fact, the main reason why Britain and Turkey never concluded a separate peace is that when one party really wanted one, or at least was very interested in one, that was because it was doing not so well in the war, but conversely, it meant the other side was doing pretty well and therefore was less interested in a separate peace. Whenever Britain was willing to zig, you might say, Turkey was about to zag. In fact, what I argue in the book and what I think I demonstrate is that the Balfour Declaration was the highly contingent result of a tortuous process that might have turned out very differently. That process was characterized as much by deceit and by betrayal as by adherence to principle and liberal values. And today we've touched only the tip of the iceberg so far as deceit and betrayal go. Some of you will know the Greek myth. Cadmus slew the dragon. Athena told him to plant the dragon's teeth. From the ground rose up soldiers. I think that during World War I, Britain sowed dragon's teeth in the Middle East. Their fruit was resentment, suspicion, recrimination, hatred. Eventually, new soldiers rose up from the ground, and as we all know, they are rising still. Thank you very much. Okay, the question was, the Balfour Declaration is in writing. The arrangement with Hussein was not in writing. But let me first correct that. The arrangement with Hussein was in writing. It's in those letters, the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. The problem with the letters from the English side is that they are purposefully vague, so that Hussein thought he had something in writing that he didn't really have. Okay, but then the question was, did Hussein learn about the Balfour Declaration? Is that correct? Yes. Yes, he did, of course, because the Balfour Declaration, it was issued by the cabinet on the 2nd of November. It was released to the press on the 9th of November. There were big celebrations in London by the Zionists, by Jews. And of course, Hussein learned about it. The question is, what did he think about it, and what did his sons think about it? And that's complicated. That's a very hard one to answer. Sure, that one I can answer. Weizmann was a brilliant chemist, and he made a very important contribution to the British war effort. With precisely, acetone is, I'm not a chemist, but I've read enough to know that it's crucial for the production of high explosives. And the problem was the British were running out of acetone. He figured out how to make it in a different way. I think he derived it, yes, from chestnuts instead of from something else. So it was very important. Then there is a story, but it's an apocryphal story. The story is that Lloyd George went to Weizmann and said, "What can I give you in return?" And Weizmann said, "I want nothing for myself, but I want Palestine for my people." It's a beautiful story, and Lloyd George even tells it in his memoirs. But there is simply not one reference to that in any of the archival material. And I just don't believe that I know it didn't happen that way. The Balfour Declaration is here, well, it's what I was telling you. The British government had been convinced that it needed Jewish support. The part that I didn't tell you was they were also afraid the Germans were courting the Zionists and would make the Turks offer them Palestine. And so the British were determined to offer them Palestine first. And those are the motives behind, those are some, they're not all of the motives, but they are some of the motives behind the Balfour Declaration, and it's not out of gratitude for Weizmann's brilliant discovery. What Weizmann really wanted was to be Sir Chaim Weizmann, and he didn't get that. And you know who did get it is Basil Zaharoff. So.
Well, I want to thank Professor Schneer.